Hello, everyone. This is the first of a series of interviews called Apart and Together with Miki Kashtan as a response to the opportunities that COVID-19 pandemic opens up for creating change individually and collectively, making visible cracks in our lives and exposing another way of living that cares for the well-being of us all, humans, all other living beings on the planet, and the planet itself. And how this came out is basically it came out when I was lying down on my couch and listening to a recording of Miki's in Nonviolent Global Liberation Retreat in Poland, and it was about money and how we relate to money and all the story behind it. And at some point, I basically literally jumped from my couch and ran to my computer and sent an email. I wrote an email to Miki in about 15 minutes. This is usually no way possible for me. If I would write an email to Miki Kashtan, this would take at least 3 days. And in the end, I may decide not to send it, by the way. So it just came out in 15 minutes. Because what I wanted, what I was called for was that I wanted, well, I will imagine just like a small child now, that I wanted all the world to hear what I just heard. Mm. And some of them may ignore, but some of them may not. Mm. And I would really like to be able to reach or be an agent for this knowledge, this perspective, this vision to reach to those people. Mm. So that maybe we or our children or their children can live in a different world. Mm. So very briefly, this is how this interview ideas came about. But there was also a very, very beautiful part in it. On the day I sent this email to Miki, it was the day that she completed, Miki, please correct me if I'm tracking it wrong. That was the day that she completed the first piece of a series, blog post series, that she planned to write about the pandemic, addressing exactly the things that I wished her to share with the world through these interviews. So there was this magical overlapping between the flows, really. And I was really amazed to hear this. And within the blog post, she already had the structure for the interviews, amazingly. So 9 episodes of interviews and blog posts, topics that were clear, and everything was there. So yeah, and then she had this amazing idea to make it something with community. So not just me interviewing with Miki. I love the idea. So we are here together to create this resource, this space.
I'd like to add something.
Mm-hmm.
One of the hallmarks of the way we live is that everything is an effort. To make anything happen is an effort. And over the last number of years, I am more and more moving towards adopting the principle of moving with flow, not with effort. So, if you had sent me that kind of an email in some other day, around some other context, the answer would likely have been, no, Özge, I have too much on my plate. But the way it came and completely fit within what I was doing, it had the stamp of, this is flow, we're going to go with it. And it has been flow ever since. And I'm saying this in part because flow, returning to the trust that flow can make things happen. We don't need to control things in order to make them happen. That is part of the message, part of the underlying message of this whole series. So how it came about is actually relevant to itself. Yeah, thank you.
I like the way the text in your website introduce you, Miki, so I will quote from that one. Miki is a practical visionary, perceiving a world that works for all, exploring the application of the principles and tools of nonviolent communication to social transformation. She's a teacher and a writer of 3 published books and of 12 others on the way. And she's a source of learning and inspiration for many of us. Miki has been posting articles on her blog for over 10 years, and she has recently published first 2 of a 9-part series in relation to the effects of the pandemic and our responses to it. So each of these interviews will be based on one of those articles. Today we are here for the first piece, which is an introduction to the subject, and you can find the link for the interview at the end of the video. So this is my introduction. And how would you suggest to continue?
I would like to have flow.
Okay.
I would like to say something about why I wrote this series, why I'm writing this series, because it's in the making still. I would like to say something, and then have you ask a question, and then be in flow. Whoever feels moved to ask a question does it, and completely surrender to this will be the best possible outcome.
Okay. Wonderful.
So I say this in the piece, but I want to say a bit more on the interview so that it's not like copying what is written. The day that it was declared a pandemic, I sank into quite a bit of depression. It wasn't about the possibility that I might die or even that X number of people would die. It was about the image that I had of all that could happen from now on is everything was going to collapse and everybody was going to tear each other up along the way. And I didn't have a sense that I wanted to be present for that. And that stayed with me for a few days. And as I usually do, whenever there's something up, I start talking with people, the people close to me, the people less close to me. And through those conversations, what became clear to me is that I needed to repurpose myself. Maybe a lot, maybe a little, but I needed to rethink purpose in response to what is happening. And through that, I came to kind of like distill something that I actually heard from different people and comes in this form. I do many things, but one of them is I'm a storyteller. I'm a storyteller of things that haven't happened. I'm a storyteller of things that can happen if we mobilize in ways that we haven't in many thousands of years. And so that immediately opened up for me the possibility of seeing what is happening as an opportunity for a different story to unfold, rather than the predictable one that we were on, marching towards, one of 50 different scenarios of total collapse. So that's how it came to be. Then this series, it's like, okay, what is the opportunity that is opening? Yeah, that's how it came.
I have a sense that my first question is relevant. The pandemic itself and our responses to it created various consequences all over the globe. Most of the major functioning systems of human societies have been shut down with lockdowns, and we are set apart as a protective strategy. There's uncertainty, fear, isolation, and simultaneously, at the same time, there is an effortlessly flowing solidarity. Space for connection with self, community members, family members, and life. And also there is a pause in consuming and in habitual doing. I wonder how you make sense of this and how you see the significance of this time.
So what this brings to mind is thinking about what is it that makes people respond differently in times of crisis? And there are many reasons for that. I mean, we all know this. And they're short-term acute crises, and there are longer-term crises. And they call on different things. But what is common to crises is that doing what we do on a regular day is not going to work to respond to a crisis. And we all know that. What that means is that there's like it's almost like when we walk around almost like with a wetsuit, that, a wetsuit sticks to you. It takes real effort to peel it off your body. And this is almost like somebody is blowing air between our skin and the wetsuit. So suddenly it's easier to peel it off. And there we are in our bareness of who we are. Without all the stuff that was put on us over several thousand years, without all the scripts, without all the ways that we know how to do things, because we actually don't. In a crisis, we don't know what to do. So we need to think freshly. And this is where I see the opportunity for us to mobilize differently. And then the other part of it is that in this whole process, things that have been true all along are becoming more visible. So we both have slightly more capacity, not all of us, because in crisis, some people go towards more control, more authoritarianism. That possibility is on the menu. It isn't, there's no foregone conclusion that it will go this way or that way. We don't know. But there is a possibility that it will go a different way because of the fact that the scripts are on pause. It's more the response to the pandemic than the pandemic itself. In a way, if this pause didn't exist, some proportion of the human population would die. I don't really know what proportion it would be. I confess to not fully believing what we're told by this or that expert about the pandemic, which isn't really part of this. I don't know what the scenario would be if we didn't have this response. Just as much as, some 30 years ago, I had a conversation with a friend that felt like the most irreverent conversation of my whole life. The conversation was about what would have happened if no one went to war with Nazi Germany. Ultimately, would more people or fewer people have died? And it was shocking to realize that we had no way of knowing which way it would go. We are so habituated to, when something happens, this is what you do, that we don't actually think through the alternatives. So I like to get into these places where we don't know what the right scenario is. This is how the heads of states have responded through creating this major pause. And through that, certain themes become visible and certain possibilities arise. This is what I'm writing in response to.
Yeah, I think this goes right into a question that I have for you, Miki, where it's like this great unknowability of the future that's being caused by the pause. And I'm wondering, when I think of that, like with some of my family members, I'm guessing that unknowability is pretty scary for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if that's where some of the intense pressure to go back to normal comes from, is that fear of the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how you see what you're offering here as a way to address some of this fear.
This kind of fear, I think, is at the root of everything that is happening, because it is in response to, so let me take a step back. Unknowability is the truth of life. It's not like we ever did know. It's that maybe some probability distribution was different and we could delude ourselves into thinking that we know. But the reality of life all along is unknowability. I'm talking with you right now. We don't know that there isn't going to be a bomb or a hurricane or something that happens here or there that will stop this conversation in the middle. We don't know actually anything about the future. That's always been true. The shift is not that life is suddenly unknowable. The shift is that at some point in our evolution, we lost trust in life. And when you lose trust in life and then things are unknowable, the only conclusion is you need to control things. Mm-hmm. And this is what has brought us to where we are, is the incessant drive to control and control and control more and more and more and more aspects of life. And the reality is that the only way to control life is to stop life. And so you actually are introducing more and more death. In one of my books, I have a chapter that is called Controlling to Death. That which doesn't move doesn't need more control. And life is movement. So that is kind of like on the philosophical, spiritual plane. But then there's also the practical question, which is how to handle the fact that we are primed to be afraid of the unknowable. Mm-hmm. And that is a question that is a block between where we are and moving forward together. And I have a couple of things to say. First of all, I want to say, I don't actually know how to answer your question. And I don't want to pretend to know something that I can't know. It's not like there's some deficiency in me because of which I don't know. It isn't known whether we will make the transformative step or we will intensify our march towards extinction. We don't know that. But what is clear to me is that in order to make the transformative step, there's a leap that is necessary. And this leap is what this pandemic is making possible. And the leap is about coming together, because part of the fear comes from seeing ourselves as separate. Mm. And if we are separate, then anything that is not known is scary. If we are together, we work it out. We work it out. If I know that you and I are together in facing the crisis, together in figuring out what to do if there is scarcity, then that is a piece of evolutionary leap. You know, there are many people who have been talking about the need for an evolutionary leap in human consciousness for some decades now. And that leap is fundamentally about moving towards care for the whole, moving towards we are together, not separate. We each have our individual existence. We each have our own individual family. We each have our own individual community. But fundamentally, and this is one of the things that this pandemic is bringing to the foreground, is that we are intertwined. Our path into the future is intertwined. Yeah. I'm curious if that feels like it speaks to your question.
It does, especially just about the being alone, you know, like being separate, how we are in this pandemic. could enhance fear for people. So we need to figure out ways to create connection. And so
Yeah,
that for me is, that's like something I can do right now.
yes. So I want to distinguish a little bit between connection and togetherness, because connection is very amorphous. Togetherness for me is much more specific. Togetherness is about, it's almost like a choice to solve problems together, whether I like you or not, because connection has more of a kind of like, are we friends? You know, do we see each other in the same way? But togetherness is about recognizing our interdependence and recognizing that if we make choices together, we are more likely to generate an outcome that is wise. Here's, you may have heard, there's this thing called the prisoner's dilemma. It's an experiment that economists like to do to prove something about our nature. And that experiment is, I don't know exactly the setup, but fundamentally it's like, you know, both people are told, you know, there's this, you know, if you plead guilty and the other person plead, then you get, I don't know, let's say 10 years in prison and they walk away free. If both of you plead guilty, you each get 5 years in prison. And if both of you plead innocent, you both walk free. It seems like a no-brainer for both people to say innocent. But in reality, in most of those experiments, both people say guilty. It's not the wisest choice. It's the choice that makes logical sense in a world of separation. And this, you know, being able to transcend the prisoner's dilemma is one kind of like very thin sliver of how we can define our evolutionary challenge. Moving towards enacting the trust that we all can care about all of us. And even if some don't, there's going to be enough care to go around. That is the challenge of moving from separation to togetherness. I don't have to feel connected to the other person to know that both of us are served better if we both plead innocent. Yeah.
Yeah, that even helps explain it for me to understand it better. Thanks, Miki.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thinking about taking that step toward togetherness really reminds me about some of the challenges around confronting privilege. And as somebody myself who enjoys a lot of privilege, really struggling to understand at some visceral level, like really the scope of what people are going through, the challenges that they're facing. So I'm just curious, like how in a time when we're encouraged to be physically distant and separated from each other, maybe what ways we can try to overcome that gap particularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for saying physically distant, because the whole term of social distancing really grates on me, because it isn't social distancing, it's only physical distancing that is needed for whatever measure of containing the contagion of the disease. And conflating these two is actually, I think, in a small way, unconsciously, I think, increasing people's fear of each other instead of enhancing solidarity. So the antidote to, so there are two things about privilege. One is its existence, and the other is what it does. The existence of privilege is the outcome of thousands of years of patriarchy. it takes different forms at different times in different societies and different periods. So, in India, it takes the form of caste. In the US, it takes the form of race. There are many different ways that it will show up. And there is a common denominator to all of them, and that common denominator is the separation of people in terms of access to resources. Some people have more, some people have less. And more or less without any logic that connects it to needs. In other words, if I have 10 children to feed and you have no one to feed except yourself, it makes sense to me that I would have more access to resources than you. That isn't generally how it goes. In fact, generally speaking, if I have 10 children to feed, I'm going to have less access to resources than the person who doesn't, because there are many reasons for why that is. So there is that separation that is built into the existence of privilege. And then the second thing that happens is that privilege has to be justified. Because all of us, and this is where it comes back, and I think it kind of like will cycle again and again to this sense that what we think about who we are as humans has everything to do with how we're going to respond to crisis, how we're going to respond to anything. So my personal faith is that all of us are born with a certain amount of care, that our souls care and want everyone's needs to be attended to. So when we look at a world in which resources are divided in ways that don't make sense, we need to come up with a theory that explains why. That theory is what has led to this idea that people deserve what they have. So that's the second layer of privilege, is that both the people with more access and the people with less access are trained to believe that this uneven, illogical distribution of resources that is not related to needs, that it actually makes sense, that it has reasons, that if I have more, it says something about me. Either, there are various and sundry theories. The one that is prevalent now in much of the world is this idea of merit. I worked hard, I went to school, all of these things make me superior to somebody else. It is that piece that makes it hard to have the imagination. It's not just the fact of having different access to resources. It's that I somehow think, consciously or unconsciously, fully or partially, that there is such a thing as those people. And as soon as there's those people, whether they have more or less than me, they are those people. It's hard for me to imagine their existence. It's hard for me to imagine the narrative of their life. This is the place where we connect, is when we are able to understand each other's narratives. Because our experience isn't just the events, it's the narrative, it's the constant narrative that we tell ourselves about what is happening. So it's possible to train the imagination. It's possible, and I find it absolutely rich and delicious. I have stepped into the shoes of people such as George W. Bush, a veteran just coming back from war, angry with other people that they are against the war. Someone who molested an 8-year-old girl. Someone who stole money and all the connections from his wife and left her bereft without any meaning or sustainability. So I've stepped into the shoes of many people that are completely foreign to who I am and how I think and how I operate. And every time that I do that, I find my world expanding. So I would say to imagine the lives of people who are now really suffering, who are really lacking privilege. And they are, you know, you can think of different categories of people because the situation right now is affecting people differentially based on their social location. If you live in the global south, it is much more scary to be an old person than if you live in the global north. Sure, the disease, you know, takes the lives of older people more than the lives of younger people. But even with that, if you're in different places, if you have, if you're in a different class, if you know or don't know the language of the country where you live in, all of these things, it literally will change your life chances. I don't know the exact number, but in the United States, Black people are dying at twice the rate of white people from the COVID disease. That tells you something. That tells you something that is systemic. It doesn't tell you anything about those individuals, but you can imagine the fear that comes with that. You can imagine the consequences. You can imagine the need to mobilize in different ways. So it's an exercise in imagination. Wondering if that's enough or if there's a follow-up question from you.
That's great. Thank you.
I'm going to change my question, if it's all right, to go with the flow. It was something that occurred to me in the middle of the night. How do we get people to change their view from being concerned about the survival of humans to survival of all living things, and to understand the systems that we need to get there, when in reality, that's the way we're going to survive. But it's such a myopic view. And I'm thinking of, you know, things that are dramatic and forceful. I think of the anti-abortion movement that is very concerned about human life. And yet every time a human life is born, a whole bunch of other lives are lost. So how do we bridge that gap? Mm-hmm. Maybe not on that level, to start working together.
Yeah. So one of the things that I have come to believe is that humans have created two very dramatically different visions. One I call the vision of a world that works for all. And the other is the vision of a world that works for all the good guys. And there is a big schism between these two visions. Because a world that works for all, which is in deep essence the fundamental reverence for life, has essentially an infinite circle of care. If you want the world to work for all, you need to care for all. And a world that works for all the good guys is rooted in scarcity thinking. There isn't going to be enough for all, and therefore I have to care for mine, for what is good, control everything that is bad, take it out of sight, kill it if necessary, punish it if killing isn't the ultimate thing, but somehow move everything that isn't aligned with my vision to the banished area of life. That logic, paradoxically, also exists within those of us who have a vision of a world that works for all. Because fundamentally we're saying, I'm looking for a world that works for all, except for the people who don't believe in a world that works for all. So when we make that move, we are actually reenacting the same script. So, and where do I see it in what you're saying? It's very subtle and small, innocent looking. How do we get people to change their view? The moment, it's so humbling. I mean, I am not exempting myself from what you're saying. It's just that it's sometimes I can see the hubris in that, and then I come back to humility. I don't actually know. I don't know anything. I don't even know that I am right, that the thing to do is to create a world that works for all. I don't even know that. I believe in it very strongly, but I don't actually know that. So if I bring humility, curiosity, care, open-heartedness to my conversation with the person, I have much more of a chance of getting somewhere together. I once had a conversation with a Tea Party activist. This is about, I don't know, like 9 years ago, when the Tea Party was very active in the United States. Precursor to Donald Trump. And the two things stand out to me from that conversation that I remember 9 years later. One is, I was born and raised in Israel. He was born and raised in Estonia. I think that was the country that he came from. He was older than me by 10, 15 years. We both went to live in the United States. And it turned out that as children, we both loved the same author. A German author that I think is not known in the United States. His name is Karl May, and he wrote about, about Native Americans. In my memory from all these decades later, I think he was, quite benign in relation to them and didn't paint them as bad. It was, interesting and rich. I don't know if I would think that now with all I know now, but that is aside. Suddenly there was this very strange commonality, a random commonality that was, I think, reminded both of us that we are both humans in some fundamental ways that are similar. It made it impossible to treat each other as other. That's one thing that stands out to me. The other is a bit more complex, which is, he of course pegged me as a liberal, which I don't peg myself as a liberal. I don't peg myself as any label other than feminist and committed to nonviolence. Those are my only two labels. But that aside, and pegging me as a liberal, he believed me to be one of those people who think that state intervention is the solution to problems. And so we ended up having a conversation about that. I entered the whole conversation without intending to say anything to him, only to hear. And then I learned something that shifted my view on something, not his, mine. What I learned is that both conservatives and liberals have a limited view of human nature. That the conservatives don't believe that people would do anything without incentives, that we are not motivated enough, and therefore you have to have all these incentives. And the liberals have a different picture of that. They don't believe we will take care of each other on our own. We need government to do it for us. And suddenly, and it turns out, I haven't researched it carefully, but it turns out that in certain ways, there's more charity giving among conservatives than among liberals. That is interesting. Why don't we think about what makes that so? And so it helped me, kind of like destabilize, neatly packaging people into groups with certain characteristics and coming into a place of much more humility about what things mean. I didn't follow up to have more conversation with him. And so I only have this little bit, but it left me very deeply moved and micro-transformed. Second thing is that, I don't know, maybe it's the third thing, but one more thing that I want to say is there is a philosopher, a Scottish philosopher called Alistair MacIntyre, and he talks about something that he calls an epistemological crisis. It sounds very highfalutin. I will explain what it means. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with knowing, with knowledge. How do we acquire knowledge? How do we know that something is something we know or not, etc.? An epistemological crisis can simply be described as, if this is true, this new thing that I just discovered, if this is true, then everything else that I've ever believed is not true. Those of us who come out of mainstream thinking can probably point to moments in our life when we had that experience. It's tough. It's not easy. My best example of it is not relevant to this story, but the phenomenon is so important that I want to talk about it, which is I was visiting a friend's father who was dying of pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer in Western medicine is a death sentence. And I was there with a friend, and when we left, I said to her, I don't understand something. Western medicine has nothing to offer him. What has he got to lose from trying other things? There is anecdotal evidence of other things that help with pancreatic cancer. I don't know if they work or not, but what has he got to lose? And she said he has his entire worldview to lose. Especially since, then she told me, he himself was a physician, a medical doctor. So he would have that to lose. And the gaping hole that is open when everything you have always believed in suddenly is destabilized, it's very hard. So if we know that, then rather than challenging people, I want to find a way to offer a combination of gentle holding and confrontation, not just the confrontation. The confrontation will not do this. So it's gentle holding, togetherness, offering the togetherness. It's like, if you're going to walk away from where you are, I'm here. You're not going to have to do this journey on your own. How many of us actually have it to offer people we disagree with strongly? Most of us don't. But when a rabbi, a cantor, and his wife moved to the south of the United States and started getting threatening calls from the Ku Klux Klan, and this is a true story, it's written up. There's a book about it, there's a podcast. It's called Not by the Sword. And they tracked down the number, they called and left a message of love. And they did it every week. After a few months, they got a call from the guy who was leaving the death threats, who was a retired Grand Dragon or whatever, I don't know the ranking within the Ku Klux Klan system, diabetic in a wheelchair. He called them and said, I want to talk, I need your help. They connected. And he ended up spending the last year of his life living in their basement. They took him in. His friends, his former colleagues did not take him in. They took him in. He was in their basement, and the last year of his life he was making amends for all the harm that he had done before. So, sure, it's like an unusual story. It's one of a kind. But does it have to be one of a kind? Or is this the time where we can do more of this? Where those of us who grasp togetherness, non-separation, caring for the whole, where we can exit our bubble and make our world more inviting. I don't know the answer, but it's a question.
I have a quote that you put in the article of your friend Emma.
So this quote from Emma is, anchor the now increased need for togetherness and cooperation into a compelling new normal that has the robustness to withstand a backlash into capitalist norm when this first corona wave passes.
When I read it, it feels like maybe this is a way to grasp your theory of change. And I wanted to ask you to put some more words to it.
Yeah.
Maybe some examples. If you see, you wrote this article a month ago, and I'm guessing we can also witness a few things. So.
I don't have examples. And in all honesty, I don't have a theory of change, and I don't believe anyone has a theory of change that is on a global scale.
Can I be a little rude? I think you do have. Like, I don't think like how to change the world in a global scale, but I think the way you live, I
yes.
think that
Okay,
the moment you're part of, and
so what I mean is, this is back to humility. I don't have a grand narrative about how we change the largest structures of our life, because, and this is one of the places where I feel so intrigued by the presence of this pause and, mini collapse that is happening, which is the global systems of neoliberalism are so intertwined that, you get the CEO of this corporation to become fully collaborative, etc., etc., etc. He, and it's generally he, will be eaten up by the system as it is. He will be vomited out of that corporation, and they will find 500 other potential CEOs who would be happy to come in there. This relates to that deep thing that systemic problems cannot be solved individually. Once I accept that I cannot plan global change, I can only be available for it, both individually and as movements, then the theory of change that I have is a very humble theory of change. And that is, whoever I am, whether I am an individual, a community, a movement, an organization, whoever I am, if I want to be part of that shift, then I start where I am exactly, or where we are exactly, and move in the direction of that vision, however far we can move, without doing violence to ourselves or to others. So what I mean about without doing violence is a question that I don't have an answer for. So a couple of years ago, I read a book called Fan Shen, which is a very thick book. I didn't read the whole book. I read big parts of it. It's an amazing document It's a kind of an anthropological case study that took place over 1 year in one village in China during the revolution. So that it takes place in 1948, 1949. And it chronicles and documents what was done to establish communism, not in some kind of principle or concept, but in the day-to-day life, how they tried to create that shift in villages, in places that had been completely and fully habituated to total domination, feudalism. This wasn't capitalist at the time, it was a feudal society. How do you jump from feudalism to collective living? And it was fantastic for me to see it because it filled me with compassion for everyone, ranging from the party officers to the villagers, to the rich people, to everyone who was caught in that transition. But first and foremost, it gave me anguished respect for the overwhelming nature of doing it, because what they did was violent and it didn't succeed. The principle that I am trying to now exercise in the one experiment that I'm part of called the Nonviolent Global Liberation Community, the principle is the principle of willingness and capacity. Meaning that so long as you know where you want to go, you start where you are and you take one step at a time with where you are, stretching only within capacity and within what can be held within collective capacity. There's something about that that to me feels revolutionary, because you don't lose ground when you do that. You do a revolution, you establish the new structures, but you lose so much ground because you seed new mistrust, new resentment, new fear, new everything, every step of the way. So far, we haven't had any revolution that has actually succeeded. We haven't. Every single one of the revolutions that have happened so far has recreated some form of patriarchal domination system, looking different, different rules, different people ruling different other people, but hasn't changed the fundamental structure of domination. So the dilemmas of how far you can go in that way, what is actually, even within a community, what is the critical mass that is necessary to anchor new agreements such that other people who are more frightened can go along with it without getting overwhelmed and retaliating? This is yet to be discovered. But the theory of change is move from where you are, based on what you know, in the direction of vision, within capacity and willingness. That is maybe the theory of change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess it's going back. It's like circling back in that willingness and capacity to this whole idea of physical distancing. And I keep hearing that as a strategy to really prioritize physical health and well-being. And what I'm not seeing is the need for togetherness and connection physically, mm-hmm. as being held with equal care, as even like awareness that is something that we all need. And I'm just curious, any thoughts you have around that?
The thought that comes to mind is this again. I mean, humility is going to come up a lot in these conversations, but one of the pieces of it is this. What do you measure as indicators of success? If you measure only how many people die from this disease, and you don't look at how many people die from anything ranging from, so like last I heard in Israel, which is where I'm from, 700% increase in domestic violence. Surely some of these women are going to be killed, and it's mostly women who are, that's not going to be measured as a death related to the COVID disease. How many more people are starving in the global south now? We don't know. How many people are killing themselves because of social isolation? We don't know. What is or isn't going to be accounted for as related to this disease is I don't know if we will ever know. Was this the best policy? Who will evaluate that? Based on what criteria? So that is the main thing that is coming to mind. That I just don't know who thought of this as the best strategy, and what costs to whom did they include in the thinking about it. Yeah, that is how I would address your question. Does that speak to your concerns?
Yeah, I love that you just said, that you just named that piece of it, like who's coming up with this, and just to even think about that in this broader context. So yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So you talk in the article about this crisis being an opportunity to surrender to death as part of life. And I guess what I've come across is the assumption that nonviolence means never harming anyone, always protecting against death.
Okay.
And yeah, so
what so there's a place of starting that is a kind of profoundly disturbing spiritually. Life has evolved to create a closed system. It's not an open system. The closed system means that with the exception of the sun, which gets, which activates plants, with the exception of that energy, everything else is in a loop of everything that lives eats and is then eaten, which is an insight that I got from a woman called Lear Keith. So we are always seeking food and becoming food. There is no way to protect all life. No way, because to protect all life is to eliminate life. If your body wasn't constantly killing certain organisms within you, you would die. So that is the law of life. And to me, the beauty of that on a spiritual plane is that nonviolence always must involve discernment. There are no rules. I just finished posting an article, my first article on Medium, which is called, Is Nonviolent Use of Force an Oxymoron? And it's a long article, 8,000 words. But the reality that life not only requires death, it requires killing. In order to eat, something has to be killed. And pretending like eating plants isn't killing is an easy way out. We are constantly killing life to preserve life. So that's the background. It's one piece of it that I want to rest in. And a lot of this I came to understand when I was dealing with cancer, and I was struggling to make the decision to embrace chemotherapy because I didn't want to go to war against my own body. Because I saw the cancer cells as part of my body that was going through crazy multiplication, but still a part of my body. And I came to realize that it was not a sustainable life form. There was no way for my cancer cells to have a life. They were going to have a short life no matter what. The only difference is, was I going to die with them, or were they going to die and I was going to stay alive? That was part of what made it possible for me to choose this, to recognize that killing is sometimes essential.
So how does that just seems scary to me when we think about people in privilege like myself, how
Totally.
if we think something has to die and we're not thinking about the people in the global majority that, and so I just don't understand how people in privileged positions can go forward with that line of thought when we already sort of take other people as expendable.
Okay. What you just did is you swung the pendulum all the way to the other end.
Uh-huh.
So releasing the idea that there's a right answer puts you on a razor edge of always having to discern.
Mm-hmm.
And then you create your own variables for discernment. I have mine. You will need to develop your own.
And examples of that would be like my willingness and my capacity and
okay, so I'm not going to remember all of it by heart, but in that article about use of force, I remember some of the variables that I derived is if I'm going to use force within a paradigm of nonviolence, I want to use the least amount of force possible with the most amount of love possible, with the most choice possible, and with the most support possible to make the discernment. That in itself, it's a little more nuanced than this, but that in itself creates a practice of discernment. It's not a facile, easy decision. It's like, oh, I don't like them, so I'm going to kill them,
Mm-hmm.
And there's one more sentence that you didn't say now, and for me it's really important because
and to mourn that I have and to mourn that I don't have any other way that I see to protect what I care about. If the mourning is not part of it, then I get encrusted. Then I become part of the problem. The mourning is like is forcing me. It's an anti-privilege thing, because privilege blinds you to the impact of your actions. That is what it does. It blinds you to the impact of your actions. I'm looping back to pieces in the earlier question that I didn't address then. And so mourning the impact and mourning that you don't know what else to do. I mean, just start with more. Do you have a smartphone, Claudia?
Mm-hmm.
Are you mourning every day the women in the Congo that are being killed for you to be able to have it?
Mm-hmm.
That's a place. So I have chosen not to have a smartphone. I don't know if that choice will be forever, but every time I keep thinking about it, I keep remaking the same choice. There are multiple reasons, and one of them is to reduce the rare earth mineral impact. It's nothing. I'm one human being against billions of people who have gone the smartphone route. But it doesn't matter because I'm not doing that to change the global system. I'm doing that to keep me on my toes in how I live. And that prepares me to be ready for the opportunity of whatever it is when it arises, to be ready because I'm already in practice. Yeah.